Welcome. My name is Mark Engleman, and welcome to another presentation on ERP quicksand and opportunities. The information here is based on over 1,000 projects at my company since 1996, where the buyer's interests were paramount in the process. Today's topic is on what we call the ERP boundary. What should ERP support in a given company? This is an expanded video from a summary video that was produced on this topic that you may have followed the link from. The ERP boundary may also be called the domain of ERP, the footprint, the reach, and you can see in the diagram to my left is an example of an ERP or enterprise application diagram, but it shows the ERP boundary in the center. It's the big orange box that you see, and the white objects are process areas like purchasing and production scheduling, and the boxes with a gray background are application types that support those processes. So the focus is, of course, where is the legitimate boundary for ERP? Now, this topic of the legitimate boundary for ERP at a company is not usually considered well or understood when companies embark upon locating a new ERP or making major improvements to an existing ERP. When there's uncertainty about the boundary, it shows up in an ERP selection as just inefficient activity around the boundary, where the buyer is looking at modules, capabilities of ERP systems that they really shouldn't be looking at, or the reverse, not considering functionality that really is the legitimate domain for the class of ERP they're looking at. It usually, though, is looking at more capability than should be looked at, and that turns into purchasing access to ERP that should not have been. That cost continues on. Those modules, capabilities may be used reasonably efficiently, but oftentimes they're not, because they were not the better way to go to support those processes. And so they can cause conflict and inefficiencies and indecision and implementation, and just it's baked into the situation pretty much permanently until some major fix comes along later. So the question is, how should a company reasonably establish their ERP boundary if they are making, replacing ERP or making major improvements? So the first thing to consider is the legitimate domain of the class of ERP being reviewed. That varies depending on the size of the company, the nature of the industry, but that's first useful to know. What happens naturally in the ERP market is the sellers of ERP, they move to support things that make sense. They've also moved to support functions that don't make sense, but they usually get pulled back on those as the prevalence of other market opportunities, other options, even better options, specialty options, push them back to a more reasonable boundary. And that the phenomenon of that, what I just described, looks a little different when you're talking to a high-end ERP like SAP, or a lower, or one for a $20 million manufacturer or smaller. The second thing is the nature of the processes at the buyer. Some buyers, they may be a $150 million company, buyers of ERP access, but they aren't that complicated. Or there may be a $30 million company that's a contract manufacturer with heavy government regulation on the products being made that has complexity at every turn. So those factors can really move the boundary around for a given company. The third is the current application infrastructure at a company. They may have well worked out capabilities for certain major functions that are at the boundary that ERP could legitimately push into, new ERP or expanded ERP. But it's a better decision not to because of the presence of what exists. And on these factors, I'd like to underscore that it's a moving target over time. If the ERP boundary was reasonably established at some point in time, a year and a half later, when some major improvements to enterprise business applications, maybe focused on ERP, are being considered, the major influencers for the boundary should exist may have changed, and those need to be refreshed anytime major activity to improve systems is considered. Another interesting factor is the model that you see, bringing it up again over here, is two-dimension. It's looking at it as one moves out of a process area into another process area. But I could take that model, turn it on its edge, where you're looking at it sideways, and right now it would just disappear. It'd be a single line. But in reality, any one of those modules or functional areas within ERP, let's just say purchasing, it can have some depths and extended, there could be extended or more aggressive objectives of a company in the purchasing functional area that could exceed the capability of native ERP, could exceed any reasonable augmentation or customization configuration to ERP to accommodate it, and be the basis for bringing in a specialty application. So we don't really get into that in the major establishment of the ERP boundary. However, it's useful to know that there may be functional areas within that ERP boundary you're looking at that really have further to the story as to how to completely meet the objectives of that functional area. So to wind this down, I just want to mention three things that I'll call rules of thumb. Number one is there is generally benefit to spread around the functional support, business process support, to more vendors than less. In a converse way of saying that, if we depend on one external entity more and more, there's more and more risk with that. Number two is that the business development folks at an ERP company or any business software company, they have a reasonable self-interest to sell their software, more modules, more access, and so obviously their opinion on what the buyer should buy has to be carefully considered. It may be perfectly accurate, but it's loaded with self-interest, and that usually has to put it into a I have to challenge everything bucket. The final rule of thumb is for a buyer to have solid knowledge about where their ERP boundary is and where they have options to move it a little bit one way or the other, because they're aware that the ERP seller has the ability to support it, but it's an area where there is a reasonable presence of other commercial entities to support that. That creates great leverage. Ultimately, these companies are selling intellectual property, and they have lots of flexibility to tighten up the deal if they believe they have to. So just keep that in mind, that even if one has a firm decision to, we're going to use the ERP's capabilities to do this, but they know it's at or near the boundary with those other options, it's good to know those other options and use that to leverage a better deal with the ERP seller. So thank you for watching this video. And my company, as mentioned earlier, has been through over 1,000 of these projects, client projects, since 1996. One thing we've done over the years is formalize our methodology in documented form, all of the tools we use to support projects, have all kinds of documented information. Consultants have to be experienced, but this work is so involved that if there isn't methodology highly documented, and this just is our client-facing document, it's a couple, 250 pages, and our internal procedures are about 3 times this length. It's not that we forget things, it's just that there's so many little details to do it right that having documented and continue to improve those procedures over time, every project, to be working in them, to see opportunities to improve them. It makes a big difference. And we're not aware of anybody else that has this level of professionalism in their documentation, which is so important. Thanks again. Hope you watch some more videos. Take care.